Well, welcome to Blender. Blender is a very powerful software, and if you want to learn how to make what I made on the screen here, just keep watching. I'll give all of the tools and tricks. But if you're wanting to do something like this in Blender, I wouldn't suggest just going for this idea. I would suggest starting with smaller things. So in Blender, just being able to orbit your view, also pan and zoom, those are huge first steps. That is a huge thing to just be able to navigate in Blender. And then on top of that, being able to move, scale, and rotate. So being able to navigate, move, scale, rotate, that is the core fundamentals of Blender. No matter what kind of thing you want to make in Blender, I would suggest starting here with basic navigation and transforms. So that being said, go on over to blender.org and download it. It's a free open source software, and if you don't have it installed yet, get it. It's less than a gig, so it's definitely worth downloading. So it's very small, very light, definitely worth installing. So just click the download button, and you can support the Blender Studio if you want, but that is completely up to you. Like I said, the software itself is free. So once you've downloaded Blender, you should be greeted by a screen that looks like this. You can click past the splash screen, and then you see this default scene. So we have a camera, the default cube, and light, and you can select those by just left clicking on them. And for our first steps in Blender, we're just going to be getting good at navigating and transforming. So being able to move, rotate, scale, or grab, rotate, scale objects, that's the first big step. So rotate, move, and scale. And you can see those quick keys in the corner. And also being able to orbit your view, to zoom in and out, and to be able to pan. So that's the very basics of Blender. So to do that, I'm going to give a small challenge here. So to make 5 things out of primitive shapes, primitive objects in Blender. So let me open up a scene real quick, where I've done just that. So here you can see that I've built a snowman out of primitive shapes. I've built this little tin man also out of primitives, and of course this little tin man's dog, and lastly this monster truck. So I just built a couple of fun things, and I would suggest building a snowman, robot, pet, vehicle. They don't have to look like these. And then for the last one, for the 5th one, you can choose whatever you want, or you could do a mix-up of all of these. So you could just compose like a couple of shapes together, like maybe have the guy and the dog riding in the truck or something. So or have like the snowman, give like the snowman a jetpack or something, and have it flying around. So you could do whatever you want, you know, kind of have fun with the snowman, kind of like a Calvin and Hobbes scene. But that is the basic challenge here. So be able to add in objects, orbit the view, and transform objects. So that's really all that I'll be covering in this first video. So I'm going to start up a new scene. And this has the camera and the light like it did before. So if I click on those 2 shapes, I can push X and delete them. To orbit the view, you can see here I'm holding down the middle mouse button to orbit the view. So right there, just middle mouse. And if I hold down middle mouse button and the shift key, right, you have to be holding down shift first and then push the middle mouse button, you can see that I can pan around the screen. And if I either use the scroll wheel to zoom in and out, so I'm scrolling up and down to zoom in and out, or I can hold the middle mouse button and control. So with control, middle mouse button, that is also going to zoom the view. So again, just the middle mouse button is orbiting the view, shift middle mouse button is panning the view, and control middle mouse button, or just using the scroll wheel, is zooming in and out. So great. So that, believe it or not, is the first huge step in Blender. So if you're able to do just that, you have already accomplished something in this video. So that's the basics of navigation. And I should mention this as well. This is really important, that where your cursor is in the scene matters. It matters a lot. So just as if I were scrolling over here in this view, I'm not going to be scrolling the 3D view, but if I'm scrolling over here, of course, like where your cursor is matters, and we understand that for when you're scrolling. But in Blender, all of the viewports are actually that sensitive. So if I'm trying to move something here and I push G, my cursor has to be in the 3D viewport for that command to be registered. Because I'll just add a quick key real quick. So if I'm over in this editor and I have a keyframe selected, I can move that keyframe with the same button, with G. And so whatever viewport you are in is really important to actually being able to use those transforms, or to be able to use quick keys. So to move things in Blender, it's G, or G for grab, S for scale, and R for rotate. So G, S, R, G, R, S. Those are your basic quick keys. And along with those quick keys, I could scale something along the x-axis. And you can see that here, that I have the x-axis running left to right. And if I scale that along the z, you can see that scaling up and down, or if I scale that along the y, you can see that that's scaling front to back. So, and you can also see up here that will register. So right here you can see that I have, it tells me that I'm scaling along the global y-axis, and it also gives me a number there. So I could type in a number here, push 2, and that is going to make that twice as deep. And I'll scale that back along the y, 0.5, and push enter. But that's just the basics. So you're scaling by a value along an axis. Or you could just leave it unconstrained and just be scaling the whole object. So that is scaling, and the same works with moving as well. I can be moving this by pushing G and then push X to move it to the side, or I could push Y to move it front back, or Z to move it up and down. So and the same also works, of course, with rotation. So I can be rotating it along the X, along the Y, or around the Z. And I should also mention that if I am doing this and I decide that I actually want to be scaling this along the Z, I can just push S. So the whole time that I'm doing a moving, scaling, or rotating something in Blender, I can always change the mode. And I can also change the axis. So you can think of them almost as toggles. So I can push G, push S, and push R, and it's going to just toggle between those modes. And if I push X, or Y, or Z, that's still just toggling between all of those different modes. Cool. And if you want to accept that rotation or that transform in Blender, so let's say that I push G to move this object, and I want it to be over here, I left click. If I undo that with Control or Command Z on a Mac, if I want to cancel that, let's say that I didn't want to do this and I want it to go back to where it was, I can right click. And by right clicking, that just sends it back to wherever it was. So if I'm moving this along the X and I decide that I don't actually want to do that, I can right click and that cancels that movement. So right here, left click accepts, right click cancels. Alright, so I think we're actually going to go down to this step here about adding in shapes. So I'm going to push X to delete that shape like I did the other ones, and I'm going to start by building this snowman. So I'm going to add in a mesh UV sphere, and we're going to use Shift D to duplicate that. So here I have sphere, Shift D, and whenever you duplicate something, it activates the move tool. So I'm moving this up along the Z, and then I can scale that down, move it down, and I can move, scale, rotate. But important to note that when you duplicate something, this shape again, I could constrain that to the z-axis and just move it up, because like I said, when you duplicate something, it automatically uses the move tool. Okay, so here I have a very basic little snowman, and I'm going to make a little stovepipe hat for him, so I'm going to add in this cylinder. I'm going to move that up, so GZ to move it up, SZ to scale it shorter, and then just S to scale this a bit smaller, GZ again to move it down. I'm going to use Shift D to duplicate it, move it up along the Z, scale it down just a touch, and then SZ to scale it thicker on the Z-axis, move it down. And you don't have to make these exact shapes. I actually encourage you to be creative and make your own character, your own shapes. I would suggest that it be like something very simple, you know, like a snowman, like the robot, like the pet vehicle. So choose something that's a really small number of shapes, but don't worry about copying exactly what I'm doing here. Just worry about understanding the basic principles. So if you can move something, if you can scale it, if you can rotate it, and if you can orbit the view, that will be success. Okay, so now I'm going to add in another shape. I'm going to add in this cone, and I'm going to rotate that along the X a little bit, scale it down. Actually, I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to start by scaling this on the Z-axis, and then scaling it down smaller. Great. So I'm going to scale that smaller again, just so that I can get this closer to a carrot nose shape. And now I'm going to rotate that along the X, move it down, move it along the Y. There are ways of making this a lot simpler in Blender, and we'll go into those in the next video. But for now, just being familiar with how to move, scale, rotate, orbit, like I said before, those are the most important things for day one in Blender. And I'm going to duplicate this, give him some eyes, scale these along the Y-axis, and scale them down a bit, scale along the Y again. Great. And now I'm going to duplicate this to the other side and move it down. Like I said, there are better tools for this. Like in Blender, there are snapping tools. But for now, just get used to placing things kind of the longhand way, so that you're adding just a few tools a day, because if you add too many, you won't remember or be familiar with any of them. So in Blender, the tool is really deep. You can do a lot of things with it, but with that comes a lot of complexity. So just take things simple at the beginning, take things easy, make some very basic, very simple things with as few tools as possible. Scale these buttons down. Perfect. So now I have this little snowman character. I might give some asymmetry to the eyes just to have some fun. Or have it winking. That'll work. Perfect. So now I have my little snowman, and I'm going to box select around all of it. So just like if you're on your desktop, you can click and drag around icons. You can click and drag around objects in Blender. It will select all of them. I can push M, select new collection, and call this snowman. And now you can see that this snowman is over here in its own collection, so I can turn the whole thing off and start working on the next thing, which is this little robot guy. And again, you can build a robot that looks like anything. I would just suggest keeping it simple and just using the basic primitives. So like the guy in my example, I'm going to use this little cylinder for the torso, and I'm going to use a UV sphere for the head and a cone for the hat. I'm gonna scale that down. And Z, make the hat a little bit bigger, maybe even shorter. That'll work. Okay, and now I'm going to duplicate the cylinder with Shift D, move it up along the Z axis, and then push S and Shift Z. Sorry, we haven't gone over that key yet. Going to scale it down, and then scale it up on the Z. So, perfect. And I'm going to move that down, and select the head and everything. Move that down as well. Great. So that looks good enough. We're just going to duplicate the head to make a little nose. And again, the keys are G for grab, S for scale, and R for rotate, Shift D for duplicate, and M is new collection, or A to select all. But the most important ones to get familiar with now are S for scale, R to rotate, and G for grab, along with those constraining those to the X, Y, and Z axes. Okay, so I'm going to now just duplicate his head, turn that into the hips, and give him a little ball joint for the leg here. And I'm going to give, actually, just to make sure that these are centered, I'm just going to duplicate these from the center. Alright, now I'm going to select over the whole character, move him up so that I have space for his legs. I'm thinking I'm going to make his torso a little bit shorter as well. And I might shrink down. Might actually go bigger with his head. That'll work. I'm going to make a really squatty character. So I'm going to duplicate the leg, move it down, rotate this along the y-axis, and here I'm actually going to punch in a number. So I'm going to rotate along the y exactly 90 degrees, push enter so that I can have a really good hinge joint here. And I'm going to duplicate the leg, constrain it to the z-axis, and move it down. Gonna grab this whole leg and move it in slightly. And now I'm going to give him little box feet. And I think I'm going to give him a little ball and socket joint for the ankle as well, just for simplicity. And of course, I'm going to give him a hinge joint for the toes. Move that off center just a touch. Yeah, that'll work. That'll work. And now I can take, should I just take these shapes, and I'm going to duplicate that and call it his arm. So Shift D, move it along the X, and then I'm going to push GZ to move it up a little bit. Position that over the shoulder. And I think I will give him bigger shoulders again. And then I'm going to select yeah, I'll just select the whole arm. Actually, I'm gonna select these individually and scale that one down just so that I keep the same width. Duplicate this, move it up. Great. Move it off to the side a little bit, and now I can position the wrist. And I think I'm going to do the same thing for the hand. RX90 to rotate that along the x-axis by 90 degrees. There is a little bit of math in modeling, but it's very simple equations. So generally, if I'm trying to mirror something, like we'll see in a little bit here, I'll use sx -1 to scale it -1 across the x-axis. So it's a very simple one to remember. So if you have something scaled to 100%, you'd expect that thing to be the same size. It's not going to change at all. But if you scale it -100%, that is going to be mirrored to the other side. So great. And then for the rotation, I've just been using the very simple like basic coordinates. So if you're rotating something along the Z, you can actually see the values up in the corner here. So if you don't remember and you're rotating something, you can see that this is really close to -90 degrees, so you could type in -90. But generally I rotate something by 45, 90, 180. So some of those really basic rotations. So it's helpful to know those, so that if I were to like try to get this back to this piece, I can just push R, Y, and 90. So really basic math. Okay, so now that I have the one side of my character built, I'm going to select all of these shapes that are duplicated. And there is a way, the better way to duplicate these, but for the purposes of this lesson, we'll keep things very simple and use just these basic foundational tools. Okay. So I have these selected. I'm going to duplicate them with Shift D again, and like I said, the simple math equation Sx, and you can see that as I'm scaling this along the x-axis, you can see that this number approaches -1 as it comes to a perfect mirror. So if I just type in -1 and push enter, that is going to be a perfect mirror image. And I'm going to slide that over. Like I said, there is a better way of doing this to make sure that this is actually a perfect mirror with the other side, but for the intents and purposes of this video, this will do just fine. Just eyeballing it is great for now. Okay, so there is the Tin Man, and now I'm just going to duplicate this Tin Man and turn it into the geometry for the dog. So I'm going to push A to select everything, M to move this to a new collection. I'm going to call it Tin Man. And now on this collection, I can actually duplicate that collection, and I'm going to call this one the Tin Dog. Okay, so now it's just a matter of taking these shapes and rearranging them into that dog. So I'm going to turn this into the nose, don't need the hat. I'm going to rotate this piece to be the nose, 90 degrees. I'm actually also going to leave that as the body So I'll duplicate that, move it there. Okay, so now I'm going to scale the nose down a little bit, and then push SY to scale it along the Y axis, GZ to move it down, SY. Okay, so that'll do well enough for the head of this little dog character. So I'm going to move that forward. And now I'm going to start working on the body of the dog. So again, I said that I was going to reuse this as the midsection of the dog. I might make this dog into like a dachshund. That sounds fun. Scale this front one up just a touch. Make it a little bit wider, so I'm going to start by scaling the whole thing up, and then SY to make it a little bit bigger midsection. Awesome. Now I'm just going to delete those pieces, duplicate this to be the neck, rotate that along the X axis, scale it down, move it into place. Awesome. So here we have the beginnings of dog, and I just have to take that one leg and position it, and then duplicate that, flip it over to the other side, and move it to the front. So I'm going to grab both of these pieces, scale them down to give this dachshund really squatty legs. I might scale the whole leg up a little bit bigger just to make it a little bit beefier. Scale the toe down a bit. Perfect. Make the hip joint a little bit bigger. And I'm going to take these pieces and duplicate them, turn that into the tail. Scale this down a little bit. And if you push Alt-R, you can clear a rotation. Scale this along everything but the Z with Shift-Z. These are things that we'll get into next class, but sorry, there's so much a habit that I just use them without thinking about it. Okay, so now I can select this whole foot again. And I'm going to scale the whole thing down just a little bit. I think that'll work. That'll work well enough. And now I can duplicate that, move that forward, and select all of the pieces and move them over to the side. I'm going to push Shift-D, SX, -1, and move that over here to mirror. Great. So there's our little dachshund. I might actually make him segmented. That sounds like fun. So I'm going to scale this piece smaller on the Y, move this forward, and I'm going to push Shift-D along the Y, and then I'm going to use Shift-R to repeat the last action, and I'm going to grab all of these pieces and just scale them a little bit smaller on the Y. Great. So I wouldn't worry about adding the repeat key to your arsenal at this time, but it's looking good. Okay, so there's the basic Dachshund, and I should give him little floppy ears too. Little floppy ears sound like fun. So, gonna duplicate foot and the cylinder RX90, move that along the Y axis, scale this along the X, and I'm gonna scale the whole ear bigger, and I think I'll make it larger on the Y as well. Okay. Great. Okay, you might run into this where Blender doesn't want to scale something across the X. So if that does happen, you can actually, I won't change this yet. Okay, so if Blender doesn't scale, you can see that I'm pushing SX -1 and it's doing really odd things. That's because these pieces are off axis. But if I push Control or Command A, I can apply the rotation and the scale. The rotation and the scale, once those are applied, now if I try pushing SX, you can see that I can actually scale this to the other side. So now if I push Shift D to duplicate this, SX -1, push Enter, now I have this this piece frozen so that I can flip it to the other side. So if you're having trouble with mirroring things, I wouldn't worry about that too much at this point. If you just build half of it, that is great, and that is fulfilling the purposes of this assignment. We'll learn a lot more about how to mirror things in a really easy way or in a more proper way in future lessons, but for now this is good enough. So again, just being able to rotate with R, scale with S, and move with G. That is the most important thing, and being able to orbit, pan, and zoom. So those are the most important things for your first day in Blender. Okay, so now that I have the dog done, I'm going to go on to modeling this monster truck. So I'm going to add in a cylinder, rotate this along the X axis 90 degrees, scale it narrower on the Y, and now I can push Shift D to duplicate that, move that back, and we're already getting the truck here. Now I can add in a cube. I'm going to move that forward, turn that into the hood of the truck, duplicate that again, turn that into the bed of the truck. Now I'm going to duplicate this piece, move it up, scale it along the X axis, and turn that into the cab of the truck. Awesome. I'm going to fix this real quick so that I'm actually true with the axis again. I think that's the right direction. That everything else has been built in. Nope. Rotate Z 180. There we go. Now we're true to the axis. Okay. And these are things that we'll cover in preceding lessons. Sorry. These are other things that we'll cover in following lessons. So if I duplicate these wheels, I can move them over here. And we're just about done. Okay. And you can duplicate this shape if you want to and turn this into like the wheel wells of the truck. And I really wouldn't worry about anything, you know, floating or anything that doesn't make sense. You know, like these should be negative spaces, negative shapes. I would just build with positive shapes at this point. Just keep everything really simple and really basic. So there we go. That'll do it for the little monster truck. So there we have the truck. I'm going to move that to a new collection. Call that truck. And we got the tin dog here. We've got the Tin Man and the Snowman here. So I'm going to set those out so that you can see what they look like. I do, for the example file, I did a little bit of shading. So I selected everything. So you have to have one object selected, select everything, and then shade auto smooth. And that gets rid of all of those polygons. So now you're just seeing those smooth faces. So that was the first thing I did. And then you can add in a matte cap. I like this cell shaded one. Makes everything have a kind of a nice 2D look. So I'm gonna deselect everything, select my snowman, move him off to the side, select the Tin Man, move him over. I think I'm gonna leave the dog where it is. I'm gonna shrink the dog though. Turn it into a little doxy. I'll make this snowman bigger. And at this point, I wouldn't worry too much about posing things. If you really want to, you can take your characters and pose them, but there are a lot better ways of doing that that we'll go over in future lessons. But for now, just to get to this point on these characters or on your models is absolutely awesome. So good luck with this. Let me know if you have any questions. And oh, there's one last shading thing. If you turn on cavity, that also makes things look a little bit better. It gives like a fake highlight on the edges. So I didn't mention anything about coloring. I feel like I should do that real quick. I don't think that I'll color everything, but I'll just give one of these a color so that you can see how materials look. Materials are their own complex system, but if I add in a new material and go down to viewport display, so the material tab is down here, and then you can just click to add a new one and change the viewport display color, and that will change the color of that everywhere. And if you have multiple objects selected, you can click this, copy material to selected. So that will, whatever object you have selected, which is the one that's glowing bright yellow, that is the one that will be copied from. So since this one is that color, I can copy to selected, and that color will be copied over. I'm going to call this one blue. I'm going to make a new material for the tires here. I'm just going to call things by the color that they are. So we'll do that. And copy material to selected. I might just leave the tin ones that tin color. We'll see in a bit. I'm going to call this one the Snow White. I think I might have to make the tin ones a little bit darker just so that they stand out well enough. Oh, I don't actually need this. I just need to select the black. And I'm going to have an orange material for the nose. And the hat is also the same material. And remember that you can select as many objects as you want to have that material. So if I select, let's say, his pants here, select these. If I select the object I want them to copy last, and copy to selected. I'm just going to give this the blue material. I think I'm going to make his shoes black too. So again, have to have that the object that you're copying from has to be active. Alright. I think I need a bit of a warm color here, so I'm going to select all of this and the nose. This might be a little bit too bright, and it is, so I'm going to click this to make the nose its own material. So now the nose has its own material, and all of these shapes are another material. So you can see that 17 objects are using that same material. That's what the 17 means. So now I can change this material, make it less orange. I actually make it a little bit like coppery. And I'm gonna make the socks pure white. And I'm gonna select the whole dog, and I might give that just to see what the material looks like. I think that's pretty close. I'm gonna give it a black nose. And maybe black ears and a black tail. Again, you have to, the active object has to be the one that you're wanting to copy from. So that'll work. That will work. I might give him little black boots as well. And if you hold down Alt as you're selecting, that will deselect things. And that is something that we'll get into at a later time, but for now, really just get used to selecting the objects, rotating, scaling, and moving them. That's the big first step, along with orbiting around your view. So again, middle mouse button to orbit, shift middle mouse button to pan, and then control middle mouse button to zoom, or just using the scroll wheel to zoom. And Blender does work best with a 3-button mouse. You can use a trackpad if you really want to, but I would really only use a trackpad on a Mac. I don't think I've had much success on PC trackpads. The Mac trackpads can work good enough, but Blender really is designed to work best with a 3-button mouse. If you are using a stylus to do a lot of sculpting, something like that, I would set one of the buttons on the stylus to be the middle mouse button. So then you can still navigate without changing any preferences. Again, that's the basics of Blender. So let me know if you have any questions. Have fun making all of these, and feel free to share whatever you make. So have fun. Happy blending.